All right. While we wait for some of our panelists to join, I'd like to just get us going again here, not lose too much ground. So I was talking about how excited to be here, and in 2019, the IMF adopted a new strategy for IMF engagement on social spending. This included a few commitments: to intervene on social protection only when it's deemed macrocritical, to protect the most vulnerable and ring-fence spending on certain programs targeted to the poor, and to increase cooperation with international institutions, such as the pilot with the ILO in 4 countries. But I think many of us in the room, including in the virtual room momentarily, have concerns and questions about how the new strategy is going and how deep the change has really been, because we have to get this right. So I thank everyone for joining. I'd quickly like to thank our co-organizers, the Global Protect Coalition for Social Protection Floors, Bretton Woods Project, Human Rights Watch, International Trade Union Federation, it's me, Kfina Til Kfina Foundation, NGO Committee on Financing for Development, Oxfam International, Social Justice and Global Development, and Social Policy Initiative. And of course, to our panelists, thank you for joining us. I will maybe introduce the people who are joining us via Zoom once they're on, but we'll have Rodrigo Cerda, Division Chief from the Expenditure Policy Division of the Fiscal Affairs Department here at the IMF. He can share the perspective from inside the fund. We'll have, joining us virtual, Shara Rezavi, Director of the Social Protection Department of the International Labor Organization, which has a mandate for social protection work and has been partnering with the IMF on a valuable pilot project coming out of the 2019 strategy. We'll hear from Alexander Kintikalinis, joining us to present a new Oxfam study launching very soon based on a detailed look at a number of country experiences with the IMF around social protection. And finally, we're glad to have Dr. Aylan Kadirgamar from the Department of Sociology at the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka. He'll be joining us, once again virtually, about the challenges Sri Lanka is facing as it tries to emerge from a deep economic crisis. So let's get to it. I'll tee us off here with Rodrigo Cerda here. The IMF has followed up adoption of its policy on social spending with 2 guidance notes for staff, and the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors was invited to make comments on both. We appreciate that opportunity. Meanwhile, the world faced the COVID pandemic. The IMF encouraged countries to spend all they can, but keep the receipts. Countries will be cutting back some temporary expenditures, but we hope they maintain new standards for social protection and underline the need for investment in social systems so they have systems in place to respond better to the next crisis. Is the fund, in fact, giving more emphasis to social spending in its country dialogues? We saw in the independent evaluation report that prompted the new policy that fund staff did not prioritize social conditions in their country programs if they paid attention at all. And ever since the launch of the new social protection strategy, we are still seeing at country level that the IMF is advising countries to curb social spending, including programs really focused on the poor, for instance, social pensions in Mongolia. Why is that the case? A major challenge for the fund is to change its staff culture on social spending and necessarily on policy impacts on equality. So can you tell us about experiences in recent years, both cases where the IMF was successful in advocating and adopting its new policy, and the cases that didn't turn out quite the way the fund had hoped, and why that might be? That's probably, yes, if you can go there.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and the possibility of talking here. So I'm from the Fiscal Affairs Department in the Expenditure Policy Division. So our unit is working in a lot of those topics, mainly social protection, also pensions, expenditure policy on health, on education, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what we have been doing, not just in our unit, but I would say try to focus much more on our work in the fund. So thank you. So probably I think it's good to start saying that the fund usually is doing surveillance. Okay, this is what we usually do on the Article 4. we also do some lending, and a third function of the fund is to do capacity development. So I will try to talk a little bit about those three. And so on the first, on surveillance, well, looking back to 2015, I would say, well, this document is from 2018, but we start on 2015 trying to see how we try to make very operationalize inequality issues in country work. Okay, so what we did is like since 2015 we have at least, well, there are 45 pilots in which we try to see how to engage in surveillance. So meaning that maybe these are countries in which we do not have programs. Okay, so we do not have lending, but anyway, every year country teams from the IMF are going to those countries, engage with dialogue with authorities and also different stakeholders on those countries concerning, of course, macroeconomic variables, but also we're trying to engage much more on the on inequality issues and social spending issues. So if you just take a look on different recent Article 4s, well, you will see that in about 50 of them, we have reports in which we have coverage of inequality issues, including inclusive growth, inequality trend, drivers, and policies. Okay, so and this is just on the surveillance side. Okay, and as you can see, we have this this document here is some guideline for country teams to engage on those issues, just on the surveillance side. Okay, in programs, which I understand we're going to be talking much more in the next of the panel, but anyway, I think it's important to talk at this moment, and later we will continue talking. In programs, usually what we have is that when we provide some lending, we also engage in programs with the countries, and we usually have some conditions, some conditionality. Conditions might be of different type of conditions. One condition that we usually think about is a quantitative condition. Okay, so quantity. So and this is, I think, what we are going to be talking much more in the rest of the session. One condition could be on what we call now spending floors, social spending floors. Okay, so that's meaning quantities that countries should be spending on social issues. Okay, so this is one type of conditionality. But sometimes we have some other type of conditionalities that we call structural conditions. And the reason we also have those conditions is that sometimes you will find that you may have not still the, for example, a registry to provide social assistance. So what we need to do before starting with the quantitative conditionality is to have first some prior actions or to establish some requirements for authorities to be able to provide social assistance. Okay, so and this is what we call a structural condition. Usually we have two of those structural benchmarks. So there's an example, a structural benchmark would be to specify the development of a social registry. Okay, this is in case we don't have any in countries. And sometimes also we also ask, before starting the program, we also ask authority for some prior actions, okay, also to be able to implement the social assistance. So we have those two. I will show you also an example later on in the presentation on the quantitative side, okay? But I also would like for you to have on your mind that we also have all those structural conditions that are very relevant in those programs. And in addition, a third function that usually the IMF is doing in the field, meaning that we go to countries and we engage with authority, but also we engage not just with authority, but also with the staff at different Ministry of Finance, basically, is that we try to provide capacity development and on different issues on social assistance, and on those and that capacity development, we're trying also to strengthen a lot distribution and impacts of different policies. So, for example, here, and this is and this is an example, but I think it's an important example today. So we know that a lot of countries are providing fuel subsidies, okay? And of course, fuel subsidies, of course, make use of a lot of resources, and sometimes, well, authorities are thinking about making reforms on that, okay? When we provide advice, we don't just provide advice on the fiscal side, meaning on the amount of resources involved, but we also provide advice on what is going to be the impact on the population and different groups of those reforms. And the idea is that we usually go there, we provide our report, and later we may come back to those countries, and we also try to provide our tools for the authorities and the staff at the Ministry of Finance for them to be able to make their own analysis and to try to see how is the best way to implement the different policies. So capacity development today is also having a lot, or we are trying to take a lot of steps in looking to the distribution impacts of those. We also have established within here the fund an inequality advisory group. This advisory group is for all is fund wide. So in the sense we provide advice to all the other departments in those topics, and we also work a lot with different development partners, and one of those is the ILO, which we have learned a lot. I would say that here at the fund, of course, our way to look to those topics is much more from the macro critical side, and also from the public finance side. Okay, which means that maybe we're not experts on education, so we need to learn on education, on health, and so on, and we need to learn from other partners. So this is the reason we engage so much with ILO on social protection. We engage also with the WHO on health. We are looking also for partners on the educational side and so on. We try to engage with them, to learn from them, and on the policy side, and this allows us later for us to provide advice on the public finance side and also on distributional impact of different policies. And I think it's also key to talk about the SDGs. Okay, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, is another topic that we have been very involved in the last few years. So I just want to show an example here, which is in this case, on the right-hand side of the slide. But then what we have on the left-hand side of the slide is other countries in which we have also engaged and in which we have reports, very similar reports to what we have here. So just to have an idea, this is the example here is from Angola. This is the country report 23-101, and the selected issues. And what you can see here is that, for example, on the table on the ups the table the upside part of the slide, what we have is what is for Angola to get on the SDG in the case of education. And one thing that you can see is that in 2020, Angola used to have almost 45 students per teacher, okay? And our advice is try to reach by 2030 a ratio that is around 17 or 18 students per teacher, which means that, of course, we need to have much more teachers on the involved. And this is not just on teacher, this is also, so it means that we are going to be require much more resources, not just for teacher, but also on capital spending for education and so on. Here we're talking in this report that we need almost 8 points of GDP spent on that. Then we have the other table on the below. The other table is something similar also in Angola, but for health. And what we see there is that in 2020, we have also almost 0.2 doctors per 1,000 people in Angola. And we were advising in that moment to increase it to 2.1. Similarly, on other medical personnel, we have 2.8 other medical personnel per 1,000 people, and we were also advising to increase it to 4.6. So it means also that we require much more personnel on the education side, and of course that means that we require much more resources. So, and this is when I'm talking about Angola and the selected issues, this is Article 4 for Angola, okay? So this is surveillance. But as you can see, the additional report there, we have Solomon Island, Pakistan, Nigeria, Togo, India, Cambodia, Mexico, Brazil, Chad, Indonesia, Benin, Guatemala, Myanmar, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, Rwanda. Okay, in some of the cases, these are done in Article 4 in surveillance. In some other cases, this could be done on programs, and in other cases, this is just be done through capacity development. In cases in which, for example, we have working papers. This is not an Article 4, but the working paper is the result usually from a capacity development involvement on the country. So of course, so means that, and this is, I think, when we're talking about those type of issues, we're thinking about social spending, not just about social assistance, but also we're including health, education, and so on. We think this is also very important to do it. Of course, these require resources. So this is the next question. So how do we do that? Well, here in the fund, we also have what we call a medium-term revenue strategy. And the revenue strategy is to try to build the capacity in countries to be able to fund and finance much of those expanding. So I will be talking a little bit about that also. Well, this is taxation and fiscal revenue. We have a working paper from 2016, I think it's important paper for us also, about tax capacity. And this paper, this working paper is talking about that usually what we need is at least around 13 or 15 points of GDP in tax capacity, okay? And well, this is important because when you look to many countries, there are many countries in which tax revenues are lower than that, okay? And what this and this working paper is about a tipping point. So the reason is that we realize that to be able to finance all those required spending issues, well, we also need to build capacity, and to build capacity, we are required to have those type of of revenues. So we have been, it's not our division is on the spending division, the public expenditure division, but there are tax division that has been advising also countries how to expand the fiscal space. In doing so, we have been talking about also about raising tax progressivity. And also it's not just taxation, but it's also about revenue administration. Revenue administration is another issue that's very important. I mean, you also, once you increase taxes, you also need to be able to collect those ones and to be able to collect efficiently. Okay. And this is one program.
Mr. Cerda, can you wrap up within a minute or two?
Okay. Okay. This is my last one.
Appreciate it.
Sorry. So this is a program. So as I told you, the IMF is doing surveillance, lending, and capacity development. Well, this is about lending in some way, and this is a country, a Benin program. So this is the revision at the end of, I think, of 2022. And what you can see in this program is that I just want to highlight here in the below. These are targets that are set in the program. And we have two targets that I think that might be relevant to highlight and to stress here. One is a tax revenue floor, okay, in our program. So I just told you that we are trying to expand the capacity on the tax side. Well, we're trying and we're even putting some targets on floor on tax revenue for countries. And also, we have, in this case also, a floor on priority social expenditure, which is the second thing that we're going to be talking much more later. So these are indicative targets on the programs. As I told you, we also have some others way to work on the programs that are not the quantitative one, but are the qualitative one, as are the structural conditions. So I would say that social spending for us is a macro critical in some way. Macro critical for the funds mean that we're trying to look for those spending to be sustainable, okay, but also to be efficient in the sense that they are not wasted, but also they are adequate. Adequate meaning that we're able to reach social targets, okay? And this is the reason why the fund is so engaged in those issues. And in that sense, well, we are working a lot on the social spending side, but I think that it's also fair to say that we're also trying to spend a lot of time also with countries making the room on the fiscal space, not just on the spending side, but also on the revenue side. This is what is going to make able for country to make sustainable those spending in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I'd like to pass it to Shara Razavi, the Director of the Social Protection Department of the International Labor Organization. The ILO has helped countries set up and strengthen their social protection system since before the IMF was even founded. And among their recent efforts, the ILO managed an EU-funded program with UNICEF and the Global Coalition to strengthen national capacities on public financial management, to strengthen social protection floors and their financing. So we also understand the ILO is working with the IMF on specific country assistance. We see these programs as raising the perspective on social spending, including in finance ministries and among IMF missions. So when finance ministries say we can't afford adequate social spending, we look to the ILO and other international agencies to provide guidance on how they can afford it. And pushing back against negative arguments in some situations, of course, works better than others. So, Ms. Razavi, can you tell us about experiences in recent years, both cases where the ILO was successful in abdicating its policy norms and cases that didn't turn out as one might have hoped, and why? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex, for this introduction, and it's great to be able to connect to you virtually. So, if I may just sort of start from where Rodrigo also kind of started, which is, in 2019, IMF's strategy on engagement with social spending, which of course was a very welcome development, as everyone has been saying, and it was dovetailing very much with the institutions' also concerns about rising inequality. Now, bringing this kind of a bit closer to home, I think this interest that IMF was showing in social spending also paved the way for a stronger engagement and cooperation with some of the international organizations that had a mandate for many of these social issues, including, of course, the ILO, as you kindly pointed out. And more specifically, I think, more recently at the 2021 session of the International Labour Conference, the constituents of the ILO, that means the governments, employers and workers' organizations, they asked the office to engage much more kind of proactively, if you like, with the international financial institutions in the work that we do in the development of social protection systems and social protection floors. And it was really on that kind of advice and direction coming from the constituents that the collaboration between IMF and ILO that you just referred to progressively was strengthened through periodic knowledge exchange workshops that we hold, but also very focused analytical work on specific countries where our country teams, ILO, IMF teams, kind of paired up and did some work in these pilot countries. And I can make some references to the 4 pilots, which Rodrigo was also very kindly referring to as experiences where it was really a mutual learning experience, I think I can say, where over the past 18 months, ILO social protection specialists and IMF teams who have obviously very strong expertise in fiscal policy, macroeconomic policies, and so forth, they have engaged in joint work on a range of topics. I can just, by way of example, say, for example, in Iraq, the focus was on pension reform. In Mozambique, it was on the social protection expansion, particularly social assistance expansion, and how it can reduce inequalities and poverty. In Togo, the focus was on classification of social protection expenditure. And in Uzbekistan, which was the 4th pilot, the focus was really on fiscal space for social protection, issues around revenue mobilization. That was also just referred to by Rodrigo. And the experience, I think, with these country pilots has been overall quite positive and has laid out some key lessons which we hope we can build on in the future. But let me just say that I believe for our discussion today, we really need to have a broader focus. So let me step a little bit beyond these pilots and make 3 key points that I think may be useful for the discussion that we will have. I mean, the first point I wish to make is about the macroeconomic context. Today, we are, in a situation where more than 50 developing countries are experiencing quite severe debt problems. 25 countries paid more than 20% of all government revenue in terms of servicing their debt last year. And now this is quite significant, and it is the highest level since the year 2000, when the HIPC debt relief initiative was reformulated and relaunched. So we are at a pretty significant and quite, I would say, critical moment. Today, these financial pressures are again squeezing social spending, which we're all very concerned about, in all of these countries that have to service a growing debt, at a time when employment growth is also very anemic and decelerating, and poverty and inequality are rising. Now, the UNSG's SDG financing report that was just issued last month did provide and did call very strongly for the need to urgently set out and gain improvements in global development finance, including the need to kind of evolve and scale, in terms of scale and mission, the public development banks and their capacity to lend, to scale up also and to accelerate the channeling of special drawing rights to countries that need it, to rewrite international tax norms, especially to tax digitalized and globalized businesses and digital assets. And it also talked about the course adjustment that is needed in terms of calling for the redesign and ambition, increasing the ambition of the common framework on debt treatment. So basically, the upshot of all this, and the UN Secretary General has been sort of leading on this quite strongly, is that without a massive scale-up of affordable financing, including long-term financing that is affordable, many developing countries are at very serious risk of falling into a vicious cycle of weak growth, unsustainable debt, and fiscal austerity, which we both know very well that is costly and self-defeating and doesn't work. So let me move quickly to my second point, which is to say that relating to the world of work, ILO's projections show that global employment will grow only 1% in 2023, which is already less than half of what the rate was in 2022. And net job losses from the pandemic are now not likely to be recovered before 2025. So we have this cost of living crisis that's pushing more people into poverty, including working poverty, those who have jobs and are still in poverty. And this takes me really to the key issue I want to raise, which is my third point around the critical role of social protection by providing income security and access to healthcare, really making it a powerful tool at this moment to help households face not only the kind of shocks that they're enduring, but also the day-to-day life cycle risks that all people have to face. And this is where we really need to locate IMF's important engagement and very timely engagement on social spending. And here, let me highlight on this issue of social spending 3 key points, which I hope we can discuss a bit further later. First, I think the key point is to highlight that the large majority of the global population, I'm not going to cite figures and show figures, I think most of the people here know about this, more than half of the global population, more than 4 billion people, that's overwhelming majority of them are working in the informal economy, do not have access to social protection at all, any form of social protection, let alone having access to comprehensive and adequate social protection, which is what our international social security standards call for. And our calculations show that to achieve even a social protection floor, developing countries would need to invest an additional 3.8% of their GDP on average in their national social protection systems. Now, the additional spending that would have to come for low-income countries is much, much higher, closer to 16% of their GDP. Now, closing this financing gap is clearly not feasible in the short term, so I very much agree with Rodrigo about the point of having this kind of, medium-term revenue mobilization strategy. It's certainly not possible to be done in the short term, particularly at the time that we're in now, when many countries are facing serious tightening of fiscal space. However, progressively increasing fiscal space for a social protection floor should be an important consideration when IMF engages on social spending. So having a social protection floor should be the basis on which we really think about how to mobilize resources and how to allocate resources for social spending. Secondly, more spending on social protection should not come at the expense of spending on education or health or food subsidies that are so badly needed, given the synergies between these items. So really, it's not about, having a slice of the pie and saying, well, if you want more for social protection, you need to have less for education or health. Taking the care of health coverage, for example, we know that there has been significant progress over the past years. Almost 2/3 of the global population is protected by a health scheme. However, people in the lowest income quintiles, those who live in rural areas, many people on low incomes face serious challenges in meeting their health needs without financial hardship. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that less attention has been paid to adequacy in some contexts, which basically translates into people having to pay out-of-pocket payments. And what we know is that investing in the availability and quality of healthcare services is absolutely critical. And the pandemic showed this. I think Rodrigo just mentioned the ratio of, teachers to students. Same thing applies in the health context. number of patients, number of people to hospital beds and to nurses, to doctors is a very good indication of the amount of investment that we're making. And we know that deploying and retaining and protecting well-trained and motivated health workers to ensure adequate delivery of healthcare services is absolutely key. Likewise, I think it's very dangerous to remove food subsidies, particularly at this moment, while we say that we will develop safety nets as a way of compensating the poorest. In practice, not only is there often a time lag because these subsidies can be removed overnight, but building a scheme that gives people access to some cash payments takes time. So there is a time lag between the two. And also, very importantly, very narrowly targeted safety nets are an insufficient compensation, given that food subsidies reach a much wider group of people, while safety nets at their best can target the very poorest, which means they exclude many other groups who are vulnerable. In most developing countries, those who may be hovering just above the poverty line or even well above the poverty line, have still very low incomes and are very vulnerable to price increases. So we really need to increase the social pie, which gets me to my last point, which is on these
I'm going to ask you
finance.
to wrap up within the next little bit.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll be very brief. And I here want to say that there's some bigger issues that need to be discussed around financing options on debt, on concessional lending by multilateral development banks, public development banks, or the reallocation, let's say, of SDRs. But I want to highlight one key point, which was not mentioned by Rodrigo, but which I think can be very useful. And that's the issue of social security contribution as a critical source of financing for social protection systems. Now, we have heard in recent years, there's been some talk by international organizations, some academics, about the need to reduce or even abolish social security contributions and replace it with taxation, on the pretext that if you do so, then you will create incentives for employment generation and formalization. Now, together with WIGO, we commissioned a very important piece of research by Florencia Caligaro and Oscar Cetrangolo, which is available on our website, and I will put the link in the chat to this paper, which really looks at the validity of these arguments. And it shows very clearly that social contributions are one of the main sources of financing for social protection, and they have remained very important source of financing in the 21st century. So it's not like they're being reduced. In 2019, social contributions accounted for about 19% of total tax contribution revenue, total tax and social contribution revenue, which corresponds to around 5.7% of GDP. So quite a significant sum. And furthermore, the evidence they marshal shows very clearly that there's no pattern between contribution rates and informal employment. Reducing social contributions does not reduce informality. In fact, reduction of informality does not really depend primarily on the magnitude of social contribution. I would really suggest that you give some serious consideration to the arguments in this paper, and it's important, therefore, that international financial institutions encourage the financing of social protection systems through an appropriate mix of taxes and social contributions, depending, of course, on national circumstances. And let me just end very briefly here to remind us, Alex, as Michael Cishon would have done, of the urgency of building universal social protection systems, including social protection floors, to give people income security and health protection, to prevent poverty and not just reduce poverty, and also reduce inequalities, and help us build the kind of resilient societies and economies that are really capable of coping for the kind of challenges and transformations that we're facing. And as Amartya Sen once put it, financial conservatism has good rationale and imposes strong requirements, but its demands must be interpreted in the light of the overall objectives of public policy. And this must include public expenditure and what it does in generating and guaranteeing many basic capabilities, which really need to be paid attention to. And it must be considered along with the kind of instrumental need for macroeconomic stability. Indeed, macroeconomic stability must be assessed within a broader framework of social objectives. And this, I think, is a good way of looking at this mandate that the IMF has set itself of engaging on social spending issues. Thanks very much, and over to you, Alex.
Thank you so much for your intervention. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to kick us over now to Alexander Kintikalenis, who's joining us to present a new Oxfam study launching very soon, based on a detailed look at many different countries. So we understand Oxfam is about to release this study that looks at social spending floors in recent IMF country agreements. Do these floors represent a real sea change for the IMF, or do they serve as a way to deflect criticism for austerity? As the author of this report, can you preview its findings and especially the lessons that you would want the IMF, the international community, and national authorities to take from it?
Great. Well, many thanks. It's a pleasure to present this report, which is being released today in a few hours. That was commissioned by Oxfam, so many thanks to Oxfam and especially to Nabil Abdo for really supporting this work. And what we try to do in this report is take on something that Rodrigo talked to us about, and Alex mentioned as well, this social spending strategy of the IMF, and see what evidence we have about how this has played out in practice. And this is especially important because if we look at the trends on public spending around the world, what this map shows is the spending projections of the IMF, the most recent spending projections for 2024, and it compares it to the average of the 2010s, so the pre-pandemic period. And we see that dozens of low and middle income countries will be spending less than they did in the decade prior to the pandemic. So there is this wave of austerity coming that will affect hundreds of millions of people. And many countries have turned to the IMF for advice, of course, initially in the context of its pandemic emergency lending, but subsequently through its more traditional lending toolkit that has these conditionalities attached. And the key aspect here, the key role here is for these social spending floors that we have heard already about. Now, these are, as Rodrigo explained, quantitative targets that spell out minimum public expenditure on selected social policies for countries in IMF programs. So here the focus is very much on public spending. It excludes all donor finance projects and so on. So what we did in this report is we collected all evidence we could find from the 17 IMF loans that were signed right after the strategy came into effect, so for over 2020 and 2021, and tracked them throughout their reviews. So in total, out of those 17 programs, 15 of them included social spending floors. And what do we find? So I will preview the findings, and hopefully we'll have some time for the Q&A. So the first finding is that there is a large degree of inconsistency in how these spending floors are defined. Some countries have very narrow spending floors that focus on social assistance or maybe health and education or some aspects of health and education, whereas other ones are really expansive, covering all spending of ministries for health, education, infrastructure, sometimes social protection, and so on. And if we look at kind of how the countries rank from the countries with really limited definitions of social spending floors versus very expansive ones. We see countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Gabon or Suriname having really, really narrowly defined spending floors, whereas countries like Moldova or Cameroon or Chad very widely defined, capturing a third or so of all current spending of governments. So when we talk about these social spending floors, it's very difficult to compare between countries because exactly different things are captured by each floor. And I'll come back to this issue. Now, the second issue we were interested in was, well, do these floors become more ambitious over time? or do they become less ambitious? So if they became more ambitious, we should see the red diamond on your screen on the right-hand side of the blue dot. So the blue dot is the spending floor attached in the initial year, and the red diamond is in the next year of the program. So what we see here is that a mixed bag, basically. In 4 cases, we have basically a decrease of 3 to 5 percentage points from year 1 to year 2. So these floors are becoming less ambitious. Why could that be? Partly because of the rollback of COVID spending, or because of some reclassification of expenditures. In the 4 middle countries, we basically see very little difference. So it's plus or minus 1% from one year to the next. So we can't really say that they're becoming meaningfully more ambitious. And then we have another, like the final 4 countries where we see quite substantial increases. So a mixed bag here. But what this shows is the ambition of the IMF. It tells us nothing about the implementation of these policies. Are they actually met by countries or not? And here I think the headline finding is that they are met. The social spending floors are met 2 out of 3 times, more or less. 65% is their implementation rate, which we can compare to an 85% successful implementation rate of budget balance conditions. So here there opens up this possibility that countries are, well, many more countries are meeting their budget balance targets, but very often that could be the case that in order to meet the budget balance targets, they fail to meet their social spending floors. Now, when it comes to the margins of implementation, we see that basically 5 countries didn't meet them. In the case of Madagascar or Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, pretty wide margins. One country, Gambia, in 2 countries, Gambia and Niger, we have this big margin of successful implementation. But for most other countries that did meet the targets, they were generally less than 10%. So there is this concern and recurring theme in these debates about whether social spending floors are actually acting as social spending ceilings. So countries just spending up to what these floors stipulate. And the fact that they're not meaningfully exceeded kind of points in that direction. Now, everything I've said thus far doesn't really even begin to capture a really tricky question, which is, well, are these spending floors adequate? Are these countries, is the IMF asking countries to spend enough? And the short findings on that side is that in all cases we could verify, basically the spending floors were below countries' own social spending intentions that we find in the budgets or in the country level development strategies. And in many cases, we also see wage limits being attached to IMF programs, which of course we know that they affect public services, especially in education and health, and threaten the workforce that is employed in social protection. So we have basically, when we try to ascertain what the takeaway is from this new social spending strategy of the IMF, what we see is that there's a high degree of inconsistency because these floors are so variably defined to make them meaningful in order to be able to compare between countries as well as within countries, because the definition of social spending floors can change from one year to the next. we find that they're inadequate. It's the points I just mentioned about kind of lagging behind country spending intentions. And we see that their implementation rate is a lot lower than the implementation rate for other conditions. So what could be done? What the report concludes is that there is a better way. And perhaps instead of talking about social spending floors, we should be thinking about social spending goals, right? So goals that are grounded in in country development strategies, that are grounded on progressive revenue raising measures, that also incorporate a very high gender ambition. The IMF does have a gender mainstreaming strategy that they approved about a year ago, and we still see a lag for the introduction of the insights from that strategy into the conditionality of the programs. And what is missing very much is a universalizing ambition. Is this idea that universal social protection in line with the Sustainable Development Goals should be a guiding principle for the design of policies. Instead, we see very much the advocacy of targeted approaches, targeted social protection approaches. At the same time, kind of transparency and disaggregation of data is important. If we as observers, as civil society, as academics and policymakers are trying to keep track of what is happening with social spending, especially in countries that go to the IMF, so in countries that are facing economic hard times, we need disaggregated data that we can compare across time in relatively real time. So the IMF could and should present disaggregated data on top of the different ways in which it aggregates the social spending floors. And then the final point, and I'll stop there, has to do with changing the design of spending floors. So what do we mean by this? First is the importance of conducting distributional impact assessments as part of preparatory work for lending programs. And indeed, in many countries, that is already done, but we think it could be much expanded. The focus should also be on reducing inequalities rather than simply mitigating the harm done by crisis and austerity on the poorest segments of the population. And as well as kind of trying to protect the wages of workers in public services, who are at the end of the line the ones who will have to help countries mitigate the adverse effects of the crisis and help them achieve higher levels of social protection. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, thank you. And now, finally, I'd like to turn it to Dr. Aylan Kadirgamar from the Department of Sociology at the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka. He'll talk to us about the challenges Sri Lanka is facing as it tries to emerge from a deep economic crisis. And I think it's fair to say that Sri Lanka has been severely rocked by international shocks and policy choices, admittedly, and it's now meant to be on a recovery path. But is it really? To put the question differently, is it on the best of the conceivable recovery paths Sri Lanka could be going on right now? Dr. Kadirgamar is a close observer of the economy and society in Sri Lanka, can help us understand the current situation, the current prospects, and what policy paths might be possible that could offer better results. So it's off to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex. So as many of you probably know, Sri Lanka is going through the worst economic crisis since independence, and in fact, since the 1930s, the time of the Great Depression. If you look at just headline figures, poverty has doubled to 25%. A third of our population now are food insecure, And for a country with a population of 21 million, we've lost over the last year about 500,000 jobs. And so all of this together, it's the worst crisis we are going through since 1935. And but that was also a time when we went through a malaria crisis, and much worse than, in fact, the COVID epidemic, and we lost 2% of our population. But that also led to, Sri Lanka's strongest legacy of social welfare. To this day, we have free education all the way up to university, universal healthcare. And not only that, from the 1940s till the 1970s, a universal food subsidy system. So all of that led to, by the 1970s, very high human development indicators, even though our per capita incomes were very low. But that started to change with structural adjustment in the late 1970s, Sri Lanka being the first country to liberalize its economy. And we slowly got rid of the food subsidy, made it a cash transfer, and a targeted one at that from all of these universal welfare. So I say all that because the response to the last crisis was one to build a robust welfare system. And what is really worrying is that at the current moment, we seem to be going radically in the opposite direction of reversing all of that and moving towards targeted social protection measures with cash transfers. And as we know from what happened to the food subsidy and turning to cash transfers, it gets inflated away into negligence. So it's in this context that if we look at what Sri Lanka has been going through over the last year, almost exactly a year ago, Sri Lanka defaulted on its external debt. The government at the last IMF World Bank annual meetings called for an IMF package, and they started immediately implementing a lot of the IMF recommendations in the previous staff reports as a way of ensuring they get the agreement. So for a year, we've been implementing austerity measures. There was the sudden depreciation of the rupee overnight when the Sri Lankan rupee went from 200 rupees to $1 to 360, and that additional 80% of imported goods, including essential goods, were passed on to consumers. Our interest rates were raised from 6% to 16.5%, the central bank's policy rate, which meant effectively lending rates from commercial banks, including to farmers and so on, went up to 30%. There was been the demand for market pricing energy. Petrol and diesel prices tripled. Kerosene, which is used by small farmers and fisherfolk, was quadrupled. Sri Lanka is known for, almost providing universal electricity services, but electricity costs over the last year have tripled. And all of that, meaning what's happened is that effectively fuel usage has come down by 50%, and even cement used for construction has come down by 53%. And our GDP last year contracted by 7.8%. This year, according to the World Bank, it's likely to contract by 4.3%. So effectively, over the last few years, our economy has contracted by a fifth. Now, all of this was in the lead up to the executive board approval last month of the IMF agreement. But it was justified, and a lot of the rhetoric there was that, a lot of this will be countered through social protection, particularly targeted cash transfers that would balance all this austerity. But in reality, what the IMF report claims now is that only a mere 0.6% of our GDP would be allocated for targeted social protection measures. Now, what does this mean? I mean, if I am to put it in context, Sri Lanka's debt sustainability analysis is also brought out in that report. And over the next 10 years, Sri Lanka is going to be, out of our revenues, allocating 4.5% of GDP for foreign debt servicing. This is after the debt restructuring, and these are the targets that IMF is working with. So that amounts to 30% of our revenue every year from now on for debt servicing. Now, what does this 0.6% of GDP mean? It just means a mere 4% of our budget. Now, the IMF does state that this 4% is for what's called the Samudhi system, mainly targeted cash transfers for the elderly, for the disabled, so and for those suffering from kidney disease. That's how they've taken the definition from the government. But what it doesn't take into consideration is what has happened to people's daily lives. If fuel prices are so high, they can hardly afford transport. The price of food inflation or food price increases have touched 90%, and it has not come down. The inflation calculated year on year might come down, but since people's incomes have not risen, the cost of food has doubled. And if you take unskilled labor, given the contraction of the economy, in the informal sector, their incomes have come down by 50%, while their food costs have doubled. So this is the kind of context in which this shift from universal social welfare measures to targeted cash transfers are being pushed as part of this IMF package. Now, if these austerity measures are going to continue, there is very good reason that targeted social protection, particularly for an economy like Sri Lanka, for so many other developing countries, where in the case of Sri Lanka, about 65% of our workforce is in the informal sector, that targeting is next to impossible when the economy is collapsing, because one season it is the farmers that are affected, the next season it's the fisher folk, then the informal sector. So targeting in that kind of temporality is next to impossible. Finally, with this IMF agreement in the works and this sort of imposition of austerity, there's tremendous dispossession underway for the working people. On the other hand, the agreement seems to work towards the interests of the wealthier classes in Sri Lanka, because they stand to gain from the huge wage repression and the external creditors, in whose interest much of the restructuring is going on. Now, the big issue here is that the IMF is involved, I would argue, in three forms of restructuring. There's, of course, the debt restructuring process, but it's also linked to the restructuring of the fiscal space and the sort of narrowing of it, which inevitably undermines all kinds of subsidies, including this long legacy of universal healthcare and education. But also restructuring, the social welfare structure as well. Now, all of this amidst tremendous suffering on the hope of reaching some stability. But if we look at what happened in Sri Lanka's recent history, you would have all seen the protests last year, a president being chased away, and now with a government and a president who's not elected and with very little legitimacy. But in the event of another election, which is elections are being again postponed, that there is likely to be a political change which might also throw out the agreement as well. And the resolution of this crisis after even these painful years might only be prolonged. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We have extremely brief Q&A. I mean, I don't think I'm going to open it up. We have 3 minutes probably with the room, but I did want to offer the opportunity, Mr. Serda, if you'd like to respond to what we've been discussing. The main question being kind of what do you see as the disconnect here in terms of how the social protection strategy has been landing in this country or that country? If there are any other comments you'd like to make about the testimonials we've been hearing, would welcome it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a good discussion, I think. These are obviously difficult moments for different countries. But I would like to convey the message that the IMF, when we're talking about social spending, we just don't focus on the social spending floors, but we also use other instruments, as we have been talking here, or I have been trying to convey in terms of structural condition that helps to also to provide to the need of people. Also, in terms of those programs, it's important to convey that those programs are in public documents on the memorandum of understanding, so they're very transparent, and I think that's good in the sense that it allows for us to make this discussion here today. Okay, so in that sense, I would say that they're very transparent, and the discussion in terms of adequacy, well, this is a discussion that, of course, need to be made. What we're looking in terms of our program is that when we make a program, we do not hurt the most vulnerable people. So probably that's one of the discussions we may be able to do with you, but this is what the programs are trying to do at those moments, and I think that's very relevant as we were discussing here. Finally, on the non-implementation on some of the measures that sometimes are not implemented. Well, I think that we need to have those measures anyway, because it's allow us to monitor the social spending. So this is, and if the measures are not met, well, it allows us to try to see what are the other actions we might take in that sense. So I think that those social spending floors are being useful for monitoring and for trying to make other decisions if needed. That's what I can say at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's time before the kicks. Yes, I'd like to
10 or 15 minutes.
10 or 15 minutes?
There's not another panel coming in.
Oh, there's not another panel coming in. This is tremendous. This is great news. So I'd like to open it up to one or two questions here. I see a hand right there. So go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Sarah Sadoun with Human Rights Watch. I have a question for Mr. Serda, please. I was interesting that you mentioned that in addition, especially when there's subsidy removal or reform, that in addition to looking at the fiscal side, you're looking at the social impact. To my knowledge, only one recent program, Ecuador, actually includes a detailed analysis in the program documents, and I appreciate you mentioning the importance of transparency. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about your methodology in assessing those social impacts and why they're not included in those reports and whether it's possible to include that going forward. And the second question is in terms of the question around universal and targeted that has come up quite a bit, whether the IMF has a position on targeted versus universal, or whether that's left to governments, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
This report is supposed to be June 2018. You conducted this report in 2018. Is that right? The policy, what you just you presented is from June 2018, right?
Yeah, because at that moment we were doing the pilots between 2015 and 2018.
Yeah, that's 5 years away. Almost 5 years. Why are you presenting it now? I'm so sorry. I need to understand, because there's a lot that has passed these 5 years, and I don't know whether you included a few bits and pieces here to the report. Thank you.
Can take one more question, and then he can, or whoever is the lucky recipient can answer. I see a hand back there. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, especially with employment social spending, if we're looking into the quality of employment social spending. I'm from Egypt, and we've done study there with GIZ about the social spending on employment. And we did this particularly for blue collars and informal employment. And it seems like blue collars don't really care about formal employment and like social security or any of that if they're not getting paid well. And because the quality of this social capital or not social capital, the quality of the social services being offered is not good enough. So how do you look into that? How do you address the quality of the social services offered?
Great. I'll take one more.
Hi, Anita Thomas from the NGO Committee on FFD. Just a question, to what extent does political will play in all this, especially with change in leadership and as IMF advises the country to balance its budget in some ways, and so it comes back and makes that recommendation from the country level. We want to cut social spending. To what extent does that happen?
All right, so let's see. I think, Mr. Setter, we can start with you to address some of these.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so let me start with the reports, with both reports. Well, these reports are on our web, so they're public. The report on the distribution analysis. I think that maybe the good thing is that in the report we have all the methodology we're using to make the analysis on the distribution impact. We try to have a simple methodology, but we think that it's a good methodology, and so in that sense it's completely open for everyone to look at it, and well, of course, to try to make improvement if needed. But I think it's, I mean, that's why I wanted to put it on the presentation. I mean, and the same thing on the 2018 report. The 2018 report is what it's saying is that we have conducted a lot of pilots between 2015 and 2018 on the surveillance side. Again, I mean, these are not the program surveillance side, and how should we engage on inequality on surveillance? Okay, so in that sense, well, we're trying to or what we did on those pilots is that we learn how to try to do it, and the report in some ways try to provide some guidelines for engagement later on. Yes, so we're trying to build a lot on these distributional impacts. We need to build tools, and we're building tools in that sense. We have this tool in case of subsidies, but we also are trying to look to tools in the case of education, health, and so on. Okay, this is also very important because when you're going to be doing reforms, so it's important to know who is going to be not impacted, but maybe in the case of the SDG, who is going to be benefit much more from the reforms. So it's important to have those one. I think we will be very happy also to have comments on the methodology and so on. It's important to have something that's not very complicated because it's in that sense is very open. It's very quite easy to use it, but of course we can try to make improvement if we can't. Yeah, so this is on the reports. On universal and target benefit or subsidies. Yeah, I think that at this moment, well, we are in a very complicated moment in the sense that we still have a lot of inflation going on, and we, in some way, we're looking to control inflation all around the globe. We have two instruments there. One instrument is monetary policy. The other instrument might be fiscal policy. Usually, when we are thinking about fiscal policy, we usually just think about a spending side. Well, it's not just spending side. I mean, we could also have maybe a more restrictive fiscal policy if we have, for example, larger taxation. And in that sense, we are looking for a balance from taxation side. We have been working a lot on that side. As I told you, we have been working on the side of having more progressive taxation, but maybe you can also see some of our reports. We also have been working on tax expenditure side. Tax expenditure side is also another way to look for more revenues, and we also have been building on that. There's a lot of countries that still didn't have reports on tax expenditure. And if we don't have reporting on tax expenditure, of course, we don't know how much are the size of those tax expenditure. So in that sense, we need to build on that. And we are also trying to do it, and we're doing it either through surveillance, but also a lot on capacity development. Okay. So in that sense, we know that if we just use the monetary policy side, well, it means that interest rate will be very high. Well, we have been looking to some problems in that side. So we think that the fiscal side should help. It should help either by increasing taxation and bringing back to lower deficit, or we may need also to look to the spending side. In that sense, if we are going to look to the spending side, we would like also that when looking to the spending side, we look to maybe to some inefficiencies, so the money is not wasted. But of course, we need to look to a lot of different options. One option is to have much more target subsidies. This is one option. But if we're going to do that, we are very worried about what is going to happen with most vulnerable people. And in that sense, we need to see how to reach to them in that case. We have been also working a lot to reach to people in digitalization. We think that digitalization is a very, very interesting element to reach to those people. Okay, and we had, and in the SDGs, for example, that I was showing you that we need to spend on education, health, and so on. Also, we need to spend, and we're looking for spending on digitalization. Yesterday, yesterday, or I think it was on Monday, we have a very interesting analytical corner in which we were talking about that we need to finance almost $400 billion to reach digitalization around the globe. These are numbers that, of course, are important numbers, but we think that are numbers that might pay off a lot. So this is something that we also need to work much more. We have learned from the pandemic that if we have a much more digital economy and society, it is possible to reach to the most vulnerable people, and it's possible to identify them. So if we have that digital infrastructure, well, probably going back to more target subsidies is not a bad idea in the sense that we're going to reach to people that really need them. But to do that, of course, we need to know who they are and where they are. So probably to go back to much more target subsidies, we need to know who are the people in need and where are those people and how to reach to them. And if we do not have digitalization, of course, this is more problematic. And we need, in that case, to think on or probably other way to reach to them. Okay. So this is the way we're thinking about that at this moment.
Thank you. Before we move on to a couple of these questions, I'd like to give it to Mr. Kentiklinis, who wanted to say a word on some of these.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think these are really interesting discussions, and Rodrigo, you mentioned kind of that we live in this difficult moment with inflation and so on, which of course nobody disputes, but we also live in a moment where there is a window of opportunity, right? And we just went through a global pandemic where many countries did extend universal protections to their population, or did try to shelter as many people as possible through different instruments. So we also have kind of the legacy of that. And indeed, kind of the IMF recently introduced this new resilience and sustainability trust. And of course, resilience is a multidimensional concept, and having kind of social policies that can cover a wide spectrum of the population is very important. And I think here's kind of where my view is a bit different. So you mentioned, okay, maybe taxation can be increased. Sure, but then what kind of taxation would it be value-added taxes, or would it be income taxes, and for whom and how? And yes, there are inefficiencies that many countries have, but I think part of this debate on targeted social protection or targeted social assistance kind of neglects some of the issues that Shahara mentioned in her presentation, which is that these are also kind of policy apparatuses that are not easy to administer. They have bureaucratic costs. They have administering them have financial costs as well, and de facto many people ending up being excluded. And on top of that, kind of we know from social policy scholarship, there's this famous saying that's almost 70 years old by a British social policy professor, Richard Titmuss, which is that services for the poor are poor services. And I think that's kind of what we should be thinking differently about, how to go about doing it, rather than just protect the most vulnerable, how to have an optimum level of social spending rather than a minimum level of social spending. And I think kind of with the ILO, the WHO, many other organizations are kind of pushing the envelope in that direction. So I hope we can have more discussions in that direction.
Just a quick reaction on that. I think it's a good discussion. What I would like to stress from our side is that when we're talking about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, these are goals that are much more medium-term goals. But when we're looking in that sense, we're trying to, of course, to have very good quality services on education and health, infrastructure, and so on. So I think that's the goal we're trying to look for. And as you can see from our reports and what I show also, resources are needed in quite a large amount. In our calculation, that could be around 15 to 17 points of GDP. So we need to try to do that. Okay. So this is the medium-term discussion, and of course we need to go in that sense. Now, in terms of what is going to happen this year, probably in that sense, since we have this very complicated context on the macroeconomic side, well, of course we need to think on how fiscal policy might help to going back to much more equilibrium on the macro side, because we're thinking much more on inflation, and we know that inflation is also hurting people. So in that sense, probably when we're talking about target subsidies, of course we can have the discussion what do we mean by targeting, okay? So does it mean that we need to focus on the 10% of the population, 20% of the population, 60% of the population? That's a question. 80% of the question. That's a question we may ask, okay? So that's something that we should be talking, and probably that depends in each country. I mean, probably there are countries in which we have much more inequality, and in those countries probably we need to target a larger part of the population. But there might be much more other countries in another situation in which we might think differently. And of course, we also are trying to think that we have available some tools to reach to people that need. And well, we were talking about digitalization and so on. If we don't have those tools, well, probably the situation is different. So I don't want that we have this idea that that we're trying to just lower in spending. We are not trying to do that. As a matter of fact, we are trying to reach the Sustainable Development Goals as soon as possible. We always have been talking about 2030. Hopefully, we could do that. This is of course 2030 is very near. But anyway, I mean, we have these goals that are important goals, and we need to see how to reach that. And in that sense, we need to be talking much more on the medium-term revenue strategies. And of course, when we're talking about that, you are bringing us to another discussion of what are the instruments and so on, which is also a very fair discussion, and we may have it. But I think that we need to have that on our mind and on the mind of what we are trying to reach, is that we are trying to reach the Sustainable Development Goals as soon as possible. And in the meanwhile, of course, we have this context that we need to think on how to get to lower inflation, hopefully with not increasing so much or not using so much monetary policy. And in that sense, we need to think, okay, what are the instruments we can try to use?
Thank you. Before I kick it to this gentleman here, I think there's some outstanding questions around kind of the quality of social spending, with the example of spending on employment, but more broadly, whether and how we're tracking and accounting for the quality of social spending, and also about political will in the negotiation, implementation, evaluation of these programs. Would any of our panelists like to speak on those in more detail?
No, well, maybe a quick point about political will. Of course, political will is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition, maybe. So, political will is good, and probably very little can happen without it. But how can we think about political will in an extremely constrained fiscal space? And I think we need to be thinking of the two things in tandem. So the more available fiscal space, probably there's a greater likelihood for political will to do more things.
Thank you. And sir?
Yeah, picking up some of those thoughts. I'm Thomas from the NGO Committee on Financing for Development, representing also Solution Mission. So picking up two words from both the panelists. Recently there was this report last year, the Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Oliver Schoser, came out with a report on non-take-up of social protection measures across the world. And he says it's a very major issue. And looking at that, he says it's important that we frame social protection in human rights perspective. Now, if you look at all what we said here, that word human rights was conspicuous by its absence in our discussion today. Now, why do I say that? Because you mentioned about capacity building. Now, if you talk about human rights, then the capacity building should go to the ones who have the rights. So, what you said is right, capacity building in terms of, revenue, taxation, all that is fine. So what about looking at it in that frame, the human rights framework? How does capacity building then put burden on IMF to see those who have those rights, those who need social protection, have the capacity to build? So how do you invest on that is one thing for you. And for the other panelists there, you use the word change design. Yeah, remember the three things that you said, change design, because you are talking about the implementation part. Now, what would change design mean from a human rights perspective?
Okay. Yes, on your question, yeah, I completely agree with you that we need to invest on people and people who needs investment on different things. We have been looking much more on the education, health side, social protection, and we have been looking a lot on that on the SDGs. And we're trying to see how we can provide large coverage, but also how we can provide better quality on services. Okay, and sorry I didn't address the quality of services before, but this is what we're trying to do when we said we need to increase, for example, or decrease the ratio of a student to teachers. Okay, so of course we need to have probably in different parts of the world much more teachers available for people to provide better education for them. Similar on the health side, and so that's what we're trying to, in some way, to push for on the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're trying to make our tools available for different countries in that sense. This is a medium-term target, but we need to start to reach to that target, meaning that we need to start spending more efficiently, adequately, but sustainable on those, and to try to reach as soon as possible that. So I think it is important in that sense that we have the numbers, the costing of those numbers. We always can discuss if those numbers are correct or not. We think there are, but it's important to have on the table, because then you ask, okay, how do we finance that? This is another discussion, but it's important at least to start with the discussion to say we need to spend much more on those on people and on those specific topics. And we're trying to push for that. As you can see, we have been doing a lot of report on SDGs on different countries, and we are going to continue on that in what's coming. But of course, this is a medium-term effort that we're trying to do.
Thank you. And I see a hand up from our panelist, Dr. Kadir Gamar, if you'd like to say a word. We can't currently hear you, but it doesn't say you're muted either, which is a tough situation to be in.
I think the host has. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay.
And then Ms. Razavi, you're up next. Thank you.
Yeah. So on the issue of political will, to also have and then to have a historical perspective, I think, what happened in Sri Lanka over the last year with the kind of regime that we had, they were not interested in negotiating in terms of what the people would want, right? So it's a question of who's in power, and particularly during a crisis that you're going to see cycles of changes, and how they would approach the question of social protection becomes important. And I think that is why it's important, like Alexander said, that we have a goal, right? That we have a social protection goal that is kind of a radar with which we can think about one. Secondly, as I want to go back to what Shara said also, is that so many countries are going through this debt crisis now, and it's going to affect obviously development financing on the one hand. So there's going to be a trade-off between repayment of debt, development financing, and social protection. And the worry is that social protection is going to get, be the default of dropping to be able to do the other. And that's why I think, there needs to be this goal in terms of, and to make it also universal so that it's much harder for it to be inflated away or to be targeted down. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Razavi, please take us away.
Okay, I don't think we can put on the video. We were told that the video was stopped. So I just want to come in on a couple of points that were raised, if I may. I mean, on this question of the context, we were told, we heard from Rodrigo about the inflation. I think inflation, let's also remember what it also means at this moment. We also have had a striking fall in real wages in many countries. According to ILO data, real monthly wages fell in real terms by nearly 1% in the first half of 2022. And this was, the first time in 21st century that we've had real wage growth that has been negative. And at the same time, there's a big gap and a widening gap between real productivity growth and real wage growth. So this is really worrying. People are really losing out. It's not like, the economy necessarily, global economy is shrinking, no. But the sort of functional distribution of income, as it used to be called, profits are soaring and wages are stagnating and declining in relative terms. So this is the context. Now, in this context, we also have, these crises of debt, through no fault of countries, of their own, because interest rates have gone up, so debt servicing has gone up. And this is really eating into all the public resources that many countries have. 20% and more are being paid in many countries to service the debt. So this is the kind of wider context, and where we've had some social protection benefits, our data suggests that in more than half of all social protection schemes, there is no mechanism for adjusting the value of the benefits to inflation or to average wages. So again, in this inflationary context, benefits are being eroded, even though, ILO standards say that you should have some form of indexation in order for benefits not to lose their value. So I think it is in this context that people are very worried about these very narrow targeting, which we know, even in the best of times, many of the countries don't have data. People hover around the poverty line. They may be slightly above poverty line, but then, any little shock without a social protection system, they fall below it. So in this context, to then have this system of rationing and targeting, it really does exclude huge numbers of people. And that's, I think, what is extremely worrying at what we've been hearing. Whereas a human rights-based approach would not even, aim to have to start with a targeting, and you would have a system that you get social protection when you need it, if you face any of the many life cycle risks that you have. And then, you make a claim, and it's much easier than having these very untransparent proxy means testing that is used to target benefits. And, who are you targeting? 5% in an ocean where 60-70% of the people are extremely vulnerable. So we really need to sort of rethink this whole issue that even with technology and digitalization, we're somehow going to be able to target the poorest of the poor. I think it's a bit of a wishful thinking. I think the issues are very stark and clear, and we need much more sort of rethinking of some of the methods that maybe we have become comfortable with. But we need to really question that conventional wisdom.
Thank you very much. That was a valuable intervention. I think that is about as good a note as any to close the formal part of the program. I appreciate everyone's participation. I appreciate those who asked questions. Appreciate the participation of my panelists. I think this is a valuable conversation, and I'd like to take a point of personal privilege to note that starting at 4, the Compass employed food workers in the World Bank cafeteria. We're out on a picket line over at 18th and H Street Northwest, and would appreciate the support of all who are able to join. I will head over there in my personal capacity at some point before they wrap up, but recommend that folks, give them a moment of your time. But I really appreciate everyone's participation, and thank you to all.